So I'm Emily and this is Philip. We're the co-editors-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Gender. And this is also our first co-sponsored talk. So we're co-sponsoring with the Food Society, the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund, and the Law and Animal Policy Program. I'm sorry, I'm getting the acronyms all mixed up. But all of the great animal people. So welcome to our author talk about Professor Cohen's wonderful article.
So we are publishing Professor Cohen's article of Milk and the Constitution in our fall issue of volume 40. It discusses the way that milk has been treated within United States jurisprudence, specifically constitutional jurisprudence, and how that intersects with a lot of different inequities in our society, including gender and race. And we also have Professor Stilt here to discuss the piece. So we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here today. So I'll present my article, but I'll focus more on the milk part and less on the Constitution part. I'd like to contextualize this piece within my broader research on milk. So culturally, milk is often perceived as the ultimate caring substance. Pure, clean, white liquid. It's called nature's perfect food. It epitomizes a mother's selfless devotion. And to produce milk, you actually literally dissolve part of yourself. So your fat becomes liquid to feed a baby. And it is one of the only foods, along with honey, that is produced specifically as a food. Yet, what I argue in this paper and in the rest of my scholarship is that milk is often a vector of separation and oppression across species, genders, races, and classes. So in that sense, my research is really about what you could call milk intersectionality, the various ways in which milk crystallizes some of our most profound social anxieties and perhaps even moral panics. So this is reflected in the way in which the law regulates milk, be it through food safety rules, animal law, commercial regulation, taxation, and even constitutional law. But again, I won't be really talking too much about the law, though I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. So first, milk and species. So though we usually see them as distinct substances, the story of animal and human milk is deeply connected. So the consumption of fresh milk is a really recent phenomenon in human history dating back to the 19th century, primarily as a substitute for breast milk for infants and weaned children. But there's an objective likeness between animal and human milk. It is a fluid secreted by the mammary glands of females of all mammalian species. It's similar in composition, which allows for the possibility of cross-nursing, meaning women historically have nursed animals, and animals have nursed humans, most famously Romulus and Remus. And my perspective is an ecofeminist one. So ecofeminism is an activist and academic movement that arose in the 70s, prompted in part by Carol Adams's book, that exposes how much of the subordination and oppression of women has been facilitated and legitimized by their connection to animals. So there's and this is particularly obvious with so-called dairy animals, who are feminized and sexualized through gendered processes involving human control over their fertility, sexuality, and reproduction. So both lactating humans and lactating animals, in particular cows, have historically been undervalued and deprived of the recognition they deserve for their work. Like farm animals, women's work has historically been embodied, repetitive, private, and limited to things like childcare, including breastfeeding, sexual nurturing, and caring for the old and the sick. One thing we tend to forget today is that lactation was not just a tiny part of women's life. It was a major part of women's life because at the time before contraception and when children were breastfed between 2 to 5 years, a woman would probably be breastfeeding years of her life. That is, the majority of her life, when life expectancy was shorter. So lactation was a fundamental part of what it was to be a woman. The oppression of cows is comparable. Of course, it's far crueler, but there are fascinating similarities in the way in which we have commodified in a gendered way cows' reproductive labor. So to maintain uninterrupted milk production throughout the year, this is what modern consumers have gotten used to. Cows are forcibly impregnated every year. They're separated from their calves at birth, and they're continuously milked only to be slaughtered once they become infertile. So we haven't yet gotten into the business of slaughtering menopause women or women who don't lactate, but who knows? Milk itself is a highly gendered product, and I'd like to say a few words about the intersections between milk and gender. Lactation and breastfeeding are quintessential sex-based and gendered characteristics, the result of sex, pregnancy, and birth, typically. Lactation is one of the few things, along with pregnancy, that only females are supposed to be doing. Yet neither breast nor lactation are exclusively female. Nearly all mammals, male mammals, have nipples, a fact that has puzzled evolutionary biologists since Darwin, and since Aristotle at least. Instances of male lactation, defined as the production of milk by male mammals, have been reported in the scientific, religious, and folklore literature. So, for example, male bats apparently produce milk, and apparently produce milk to nurse their young, which is really fascinating. I'm happy to talk more about that later. But we still live in an era of what I would call gender normativity, milk gender normativity, in which we see breastfeeding as a female subordinated task, which is actually controlled by males. So historically, men have dictated who would breastfeed whom and for how long, based on their own agendas. So for example, if you wanted more male offspring, you were better off hiring a wet nurse so that your wife would become fertile sooner, because lactation suppresses fertility. Or if you wanted sexual access, given that the church used to say that having sex during lactation would spoil the milk. Or conversely, if you didn't want to have more offspring, then you could encourage your wife or partner to lactate so that she would remain infertile longer. A telling sign of this male control over breastfeeding decision are the few wet nursing contracts that we have recovered, especially from the Renaissance in Florence. So the contracts usually leave wet nurses unmentioned. The contracts are between a husband who's hiring a wet nurse and the wet nurse's father, brother, partner, or husband if she was married. They remain nameless and unmentioned. To this day, breastfeeding decisions are often dictated by a male-centered society, which is reflected in a male-centered spatial organization. So suppose public and including workspaces are actually deny the physical needs of women, and despite gaining greater acceptance, you won't see very often women breastfeeding in a public or so-called workspace, and even less pumping. Pumping in public. If breastfeeding in public is okay, pumping in public is abject. It would be considered similar to defecating. It makes people really uncomfortable. At the same time, the continuing gender female-coded language surrounding breastfeeding, the breastfeeding, breast pump, mother's milk, is a way of excluding other genders who may be interested in participating, such as trans men or even straight cis males who are interested in breastfeeding, who feel excluded and don't even have access to spaces that are coded as gender, as female. With animal milk production, there is also a form of gender oppression in the sense that milk used to be an agent of power and identity for women, so be it nursing babies or dairying, which were zones of relative autonomy in which female expertise and economic contribution were recognized. So these are famous milkmaids from Vermeer. And at the turn of the 19th century, milk was reconstructed as masculine rather than feminine, and suddenly dairy men controlled milk production and distribution, and to this day there's an association of the American dairy men. Now turning to the intersection between milk production and racial and class oppression. Milk reinforces and creates class and race inequities. Historically, human milk has relied on the exploitation of a race by another and a class by another. In the United States, Native American and African American women were enslaved and forced to nurse their masters' nurslings. In Europe, peasants and indigenous women from the colonies were forced to breastfeed. So if you look at the 16th century painting by a French painter, you can see the hyperbolically white body of the two aristocratic women who are bathing while their baby is being nursed by a darker skinned wet nurse. In the US, the same dynamic played out in the 20th century. So for example, in the 20s, when in Detroit the first milk bank was created, African American women were prevented from donating or selling their milk on the idea that white families would not want to use their milk. And this is not so, racial exploitation is not distant history, it's happening today. So for example, there's a new company called Medilac that markets sterile human milk, and in order to obtain the milk, they have targeted their recruitment campaign on, again, Detroit African American women, and they're telling them under the promise of economic empowerment, make money while pumping your milk at home. And they pay them $1 per ounce, knowing that if you want to produce, say, 20 ounces on top of breastfeeding your baby, you basically have to be standing there all day pumping, and you wouldn't be able to do anything else. So this is something that is very disturbing. With animal milk, racial oppression is also a major issue. And this is the story I tell in the article I'm publishing with you guys. So we know that about 75% of humans are lactose intolerant. So only descendants of populations from Northern Europe, South Asia, and herding populations of the Middle East and Western Africa can digest lactose. Yet since the 20th century, the early 20th century, the US government has promoted relentlessly milk production and consumptions by subsidizing the dairy industry and by shielding it from competition law. So the goal the implicit goal seems to create a form of rights to milk, that every American should have a right to drink milk, and that's what I call the quasi-constitutionalization of milk. But this is for the benefit of whites of European descent, and this is not just an unintended consequence of these policies. This was very much part of what the legal discourse in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was when these decisions were made to subsidize and regulate milk in a certain way. So for example, Elmer McCollum, a nutritionist who's quoted in Caroline and a bunch of other Supreme Court cases and testified before Congress, declared that milk drinkers have always enjoyed cultural and physical superiority over their leaf-chewing cousins. Representative Edward Boyd of Wisconsin, who sponsored the 1923 Filled Milk Act, declared that is before a legislative committee in Congress, the superiority of the white race is due at least to some extent to the fact that it is a milk-consuming race. Natives of the tropical countries who use the products of the coconut are stunted in body and mind. I believe one reason why they are inferior is that they do not use the milk of cows and other animals. So this is a form of nutritional racism or food oppression that uses food to reinforce institutional and systemic inequalities between racial groups. And once again, what I try to show in this article is that it is very much an intentional form of food oppression. So to conclude, we're lawyers, so what should we do? So we should try to change the law first. It's time to change the law, because the current law incentivizes animal milk production and disincentivizes human milk production and consumption. So I think we should try to reverse that. So we should act on the animal front to decrease animal milk production by reforming agricultural and food law, increase animal welfare, and decrease demand by changing dietary guidelines. On the human milk front, we should increase production by reforming labor law and allowing women to breastfeed and produce extra milk for others by mandating paid maternity and paternity leaves. If you tell women that they need to breastfeed for 6 months, then they need to get a paid leave for at least 6 months. That's one thing to do. And it's important to make human milk more widely available and affordable by creating public milk banks, by supporting human milk exchanges, and other forms of milk sharing. So thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Great, so I'm going to show a few things. Let me just pull those up. Okay. Well, 1 second. I'll hold on to that for just a second. All right, so just first of all, let me say thank you very much to the Journal for inviting me to talk for a few minutes about Mathilde's paper and for the opportunity to read this amazing paper. And congratulations to the Journal for having the opportunity to publish it. It raises issues that are just so important, almost shockingly important as you're watching this presentation, and that it's not at all discussed in any kind of mainstream media or even in mainstream academia. So Mathilde's larger milk project, of which I hope we hear more here as it unfolds, is just so crucially important. So I just want to say a couple things about the paper, which I know that some of you have read and some haven't, but then really pick up on one aspect of her work. And as to the paper, at the end, you paint a potentially hopeful view in talking about the constitutional right to food. And I know you didn't have time to talk about that here, but I wonder if that's something you might want to elaborate on, that maybe picking up on our dedication to milk is not necessarily all problematic, but could be harnessed or kind of transitioned into a broader, more egalitarian, on a species level, on a racial level, right to food. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that. But let me pick up on the gendered aspect of milk production as applied to animals and sort of take that to some of its necessary and logical conclusions. There are clear biological parallels between cows and women, as you talked about to a large extent. And the human control over the production in factory farming, though, has led to some really stunning consequences. And I just want to highlight those, and then maybe we can ask ourselves whether animal milk is viable in any way, or whether or not we have to abandon it completely in favor of the other milks that you talked about in the paper, almond milk, soy milk, and those, as you say, are not as completely unproblematic either, and so maybe you'll say more about that. But I just want to kind of quickly give you a sense of what are we talking about when it comes to milk production in an industrial agricultural setting. So just going to run through a few images really quickly, and then we'll turn things back over to Mathilde. As she mentioned to you, dairy cows have to be pregnant quite often. By some accounts, every year they're giving birth in order to keep lactating. And as she mentions, what happens then to the calves that are born? Well, we know that the males go off to the veal industry, but the females, of course, go back into the milk production industry. So what does that look like? First of all, we have to know that there are almost 9 million dairy cows in the US alone right now. That's a lot, and that's a lot of babies, right? What does it look like? This is from the New York Times. I highly recommend this. So that's what it looks like. And these are just, and I'll actually run down to the still image for a second. These are just the females who are taken off for themselves to be raised and produced as dairy cattle. So let me just run down to the still image for a second. I'll show you. Here it is. And this is not undercover investigation. Actually, these pictures are quite shocking because they were given access. So this is in Wisconsin, who has approximately 10,000 cows at any given time. Can you read that? Newborn females arrive from local dairies and spend their first 180 days at calf source. First in one of 4,896 hutches like the one seen here, and then in larger group hens. Trucks pass down each of 72 rows dispensing water and milk. After a transfer to heifer source, another facility owned by Milk Source, the cows are inseminated and then returned 7 months pregnant in just under 2 years to the dairies they came from. So that is the cycle. That's what has to happen. We can take a quick look, if you want, at calf source. You might just go to their website by yourself, but one thing they say down towards the end I think is quite important. Bottom line, she wants an A+ rating from calf source's producer customers by providing high potential replacement heifers. What does that mean, replacement? What are they replacing? They're replacing the mothers, right? As Mathilde joked, we don't do that to women. But of course, in the dairy industry, that's what happens when the cows become 2 or 3 years old and can no longer produce. Is there a way? Is there a way in which we can solve this problem? Has anyone heard of ahimsa milk? Has anyone heard of ahimsa milk? Let me tell you about that really briefly, and then we'll come back around and ask if that's a viable alternative. Does that save us from all the problems that we've just seen? Let me just show you really quickly. This is from the BBC.
If you click on where it says Ahimsa Milk BBC, like the actual, you can go to the actual page.
Sorry?
Just click on how to
Okay, thanks. Okay. So maybe that gets us somewhere, right? Maybe that gets us away from the problems that Mathilde raises. Well, what comes next then? Right? Where do you think this is going to go? Well, we have to talk about the environment, and that's the last thing I'll just say. Right? Cows are already the largest source of methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is more potent than carbon dioxide. The world's cows produce 18% of the world's greenhouse gases, more than the entire transportation sector. So what would happen if all dairies became slaughter-free? So right, the boys don't go to the veal calf industry. The girls get to drink their mother's milk for a while, then they become dairy cows, and then no one's slaughtered. The amount of land and energy to sustain the current volume of milk consumption is it's impossible. Right? We need 3 to 4 times as many dairy cows. We'd add 27 million cows in the world, and pasturing all those cows would have catastrophic effects on wildlife, agriculture, straining biodiversity beyond the point that it already is. So the Hempstead people will tell you, we don't want more milk, we want you to drink less milk, with fewer cows kept in better circumstances. So let me end with that, just to pick up on one, I think, really interesting strain of your conversation, to think about what's next. Is the future more human milk and nut milk and soy milk? Is there a future for dairy milk at all, given the situation that we're in right now?
So I'll respond briefly, and then we can open it up. That sounds good. So on the constitutional right to food, so what I argue in the paper is that those of you who've taken con law, because apparently it's not mandatory in this school, which blows my mind. Of course, I teach con law, that's why. But it's, Con law 101 in this country is that the U.S. Constitution is a constitution of negative rights, no positive rights. But then, when you read the Supreme Court jurisprudence, you realize they create positive rights all the time. And what I argue in this paper is that basically milk has acquired this quasi-constitutional status, and that in fact, there is something like a right to milk. So what do we do with that? I think we use that to our advantage by saying, well, the court has been willing to recognize constitutional interests in food, so why don't they do it in a way that's more beneficial to the environment, to the people, to the animals? And I think there are various ways that you could interpret certain clauses in the Constitution so as to protect more sustainable rights to food from, the rights to life, to equal protection, to the 8th Amendment, etc. And on the future of milk, so I think the future of milk is what I would call the post-dairy society, where if we really want to produce ethical milk, we need to focus on producing human milk and on producing plant milk. And one thing that fascinates me, I don't know if you've heard about synthetic milk, so just like there's synthetic meat, you've heard about the new burger. Well, they're doing the same with milk. So they're building a milk from plant molecules. And what fascinates me is that scientists are trying to reproduce cow's milk, not human milk. So our whole conception of milk is so perverted that even when we're producing fake milk, instead of producing fake human milk, which is what our body is made to ingest, we have to go through the cow. It's like a triangular desire type of reasoning. But I think synthetic milk is also something that we have to think about. Maybe we can do it better. Plant milk is huge, and we're only starting to understand the possibilities of plant milk. A recent development is pea milk. I don't know if any of you has tried it yet. So there are all these different possibilities, and the premise is like, instead of producing, say, corn or peas to feed cows, let's just produce milk and skip the cow step. And human milk, which is one of my main areas of research, I think is also an uncharted territory. We have the potential as a society to produce loads of it, and we just have forgotten that human milk is our primary food. We don't treat it as a food, we treat it as a toxic substance that has to be regulated, instead of treating it as our primary food that has to be cherished and fostered and redistributed through welfare state type policies. So thank you so much, Kristen, for your amazing comments and questions, and I'd love to hear about what other people want to say.
Yes, in your article you mentioned that people of color, at least, and from certain areas of the world, are more likely to be lactose intolerant. I was wondering, those studies that have found that, have they been based on biology in the sense that have they found DNA evidence of that? And if so, from what I've heard is that a lot of those studies that do find that are have some kind of faulty logic in the sense that when they can't find an environmental factor that leads to that lactose intolerance, they end up concluding that it's DNA. And the reason I ask this is that I feel like it might be dangerous to argue that people of color biologically are more likely to be lactose intolerant because it might feed into this idea and notion of inferiority that we've created, especially when you talk about the person that went to Congress and said that white people are superior because they're not lactose intolerant. If we trace that to biology, it might be dangerous. So I was wondering if you speak about that.
Thank you. So definitely there have been genetic studies since the 70s, but these days food anthropologists focus on a cluster of factors. They show that it's not only genetics, it's also there are huge cultural factors involved. To talk about the danger, I think we just need to rethink even with I use the expression lactose intolerance here as a form of it's easier because you guys understand what I mean. But I bet in 10 years no one will use those words because the expression presupposes that the normal condition is tolerance and the abnormal condition is intolerance, when actually the reverse is the deviant. It's so weird as a human to be able to digest lactose. I mean, the human body was not made, I'm not advocating for intelligent design here, obviously, but the human body initially was, everybody was lactose intolerant. Apparently it's in some population where there was an advantage in developing tolerance, it happened if you believe evolutionary theory, of course. So I would be in favor of using the more PC expression, which is lactose impersistence, but no one understands it usually, or I have to spend 5 minutes explaining. But I think that's a huge thing we have to sort of tell people. It's just that white bodies are able to digest lactose. So of course, in white cultures, this has been heralded as a trait of superiority when you could argue the reverse. Chris?
Yeah, so we've got a guy, Dr. Michael Greger, speaking on Friday, and one of his main tenets is how animal products are just generally unhealthy for you. And in addition to the synthetic meats, you actually have there's a company, Move Free, that's culturing meat, culturing milk, growing cow's milk without the animal, identical. And so I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. Is that even a worthy endeavor if it turns out that those products aren't even healthy for humans?
Yeah, I think do we know? It's also, do we know whether these alternative products are good for us? And why are we so obsessed with milk? Why do we need to call something white milk? That's another question. Some vegan activists have been asking, why do we even need plant milk? So of course plant milk has been around maybe for longer than actually animal milk, in the form of nut milk, but why is it? Maybe we need to rethink our food ways. Why do because we eat cereals? Is that why we need stuff to call a white liquid milk? So maybe we need an epistemic revolution around that.
I was just going to add, this is kind of, it's like an offbeat topic that we're interested in. I'm curious how you got interested in, was it in law school?
So as, I don't know if you guys know Kenji Yoshino, he's an amazing queer theorist who teaches at NYU. He once said, initially when I got hired as a professor, I was doing research and then I moved to me-search. and I was having a lot more fun. And this is a bit what happened to me. So I wasn't, when I got hired to teach law, I wasn't writing about these, and then I got pregnant, and I had a baby, and I breastfed, and I started giving my milk to people, and I became so interested in the fact that human milk is not regulated in this country. It's not even classified as anything. So the FDA and the feds have declined to classify human milk. It's not a tissue, it's not a food, it's not a drug, it's nothing. And so I started, writing about human milk, and then I was struck by the similarities between our current attitudes towards human milk and our attitudes towards animal milk. So it's a total me search type of problem.
Building off the comment you made about human milk not being regulated, do you think that there's a public health risk or danger of that, particularly since some milk of people who are HIV positive can contain traces of the virus, and blood is regulated by the FDA, whereas human milk is not.
So there are definitely health risks, and public health officials are freaking out about those because human milk can be compromised in terms of bacteria. You could get sick from bacteria, and you could get infected by a variety of viruses, from syphilis to HIV to Hep B and a host of other viruses. And people are selling it and buying it online, totally unregulated, or sharing it online. I just yet have to find a case of someone claiming that they were contaminated by human milk found online. So I think there's a lot of self-regulation and self-selection in terms of who is giving milk and who is buying it. And there are also informal screening mechanisms. And what I would like ideally is the law to help those. So what you would do if you were a responsible milk donor or milk buyer is first you would screen the donor. So make sure every, say, a month or so you get screened for a variety of viruses. And then if you're very worried about the milk, you just pasteurize it at home, you boil it. And just like, we know that, we've done that with animal milk, for 150 years. We know how to make milk safe. And I would just like to see the government, instead of because when public health officials are talking about human milk, it's to prohibit these markets. What I'd like them to say is, no, health insurance should cover the screening costs, or should help, or doctors' offices should help match donors with recipients, or things like that. So just make it safer. Give people tools to make it safer. Yes?
Yes, please. Years ago, there was a campaign in the developing world, specifically the Philippines. Nestle's kills babies, because women were being pressured to use formula, which they would reconstitute then with unclean water. And right now in the United States, if I'm correct, you buy formula from behind the counter in the supermarket, just like cigarettes. Would this be an example of where there's been a success in promoting human breast milk versus cow's milk?
So why is it a success? Because you saw. Sorry.
Sure. There was a time when nurses and other health professionals were paid an incentive to tell mothers not to use their breast milk because it was modern.
Yeah.
It was more American or European to use formula. Now, but they would reconstitute the formula with dirty water, and then their children, of course, would get other dysentery and other diseases. And as I say, here in the United States, if you check, they don't usually sell formula in the regular aisles. Yeah. Because, again, the hope is that women, pregnant women and women who are breastfeeding will continue to breastfeed.
I get it. Thank you. Now I understand. I think things are improving in the sense that, the U.S., like many other Western countries, used to be anti-breastfeeding. So now it's better in the sense that at least there's more education. But what I'm upset about is that all the money and energy is focused on delivering a a guilt-inducing message to women, you gotta breastfeed, and then they don't have paid leaves, they don't have free lactation consultants. Now they have free breast pumps since Obamacare, and now for the first time the federal law mandates employers to give women time, breast pump time. But this is nothing. If you want a society to be fully breastfed, you need a lot more to make it happen. So sure, things are improving, but I think we really radically need to change the way in which the law incentivizes breastfeeding decisions.
So first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with you that we should be producing any milk at all. It should be by any means, it should be human milk because it's more appropriate to our species, right? But there are problems with human health that apparently are complicated, at least complicated by milk consumption, especially dairy cow consumption. For example, dairy cow milk has very high levels of growth hormone. It appears that this growth hormone may promote prostate cancer. In men, it also contains lactase, high levels, which are implicated in ovarian cancer. So I know I spoke with Ryan Panda of Move Freak. They're the people who are making milk, producing cow's milk from stem cells. And he said they've been able to address the problem of the growth hormone. But there's still the issue of casein, and Campbell claims that casein is a carcinogen, actually. That has to. So there's a lot of problems with, at least with cow's milk, possibly with milk for grown-up people of any kind. So
I'm definitely not advocating that you guys start consuming human milk ice cream. There's been a movement lately. So in London, there was a couple selling human milk ice cream. In New York, there's an artist making human milk cheese. So it's true that, just like we say cow's milk is for calves, not for humans, it may be that human milk is for babies, not for humans. So I'm not a scientist, but I
I was wondering, you've already explored so many really fascinating pieces. I was wondering if you would consider exploring some of the literary and the folklore aspects that entrench the idea of milk as being something that is sort of synonymous with affection, and which I think you can see in folklore also often translates to ideas of strength, particularly very masculine strength. So within Arthurian legend, when Arthur was adopted out as an infant, one of the big things that they say about him was that his foster mother would feed him before she would feed her own biological child, and so therefore he grew up more loving and more strong. And we see in examples of Norse mythology and even examples of stories like Grapes of Wrath that the act of giving milk is a thing that creates strength that's often actually a very gendered form of strength. And I'm wondering if that's something that would not be useful or something that would be useful to invoke in reforms to try and allow mothers to have more access to ways to give milk to their children.
So this is great. This goes really to the ontology of milk. What is milk? So I mentioned before, milk could be seen as a food, or perhaps it's a drug, or perhaps it's a body part. And I'm really beginning to think more of milk as a form of communication. So it's literally a form of communication in the sense it communicates diseases, but it's also a form of communication in a positive way. So historically, it communicated kinship. So if you breastfed a child, for example, that child would be subjected to an incest taboo and wouldn't be able to marry to, say, your other children. But it's also, recent science is showing that it's literally a form of communication at a deeper level. So some scientists have shown that the reason why the milk produced by a woman fits that particular child, it changes in composition. It becomes more liquid when it's hot, more heavier when it's cold. When a child has a particular infection, the mother will produce the antibodies that fit that child. It's because of the so-called backwash phenomenon. So when a baby suckles, or he or she spits back a mix of saliva and milk that enters the nipple, and that gives a signal to the lactating body to produce a particular type of milk. So I think there's a lot of truth in all those legends, all this folklore, this literature, and we're just now unraveling how true it is that milk communicates all sorts of things beyond just nutrition, be it affection, be it this sort of communication that is without words between a lactating body and a breastfed baby. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, maybe a two-part question. One is, are there a lot of dormant commerce clause cases coming up recently that have to do with milk? Because I understand that that's been a topic of many of them. And then second is, would you propose maybe a change in the court's doctrine, because there's so much deference to state legislation that maybe impedes interstate commerce, but at the same time does accomplish some health and safety purposes? Would you propose that maybe we don't look at those laws as having a health and safety purpose, or maybe an alternative that's having a bit disparate impact, and maybe on people of color, and we maybe bring in equal protection clause?
So I think the most recent milk dormant commerce milk case is from the early 2000s. So it's not really anymore on the court's agenda. So the court agenda reflects the economic priorities of the country. So as the dairy industry boomed, you saw what I call dairy jurisprudence booming. It's, of course, there have never been as many dairy cows, if you want to call them that way, ever, as Professor Stilt pointed out, but the law is sort of settled, so there's not much more litigation. I don't really have an agenda in terms of commerce clause jurisprudence, so I'd really like the court to focus more on disparate impact claims, especially as they relate to food, and looking back at what they did with protecting milk, realizing that in effect they were protecting and benefiting like a white majority, that they were basically privileging white biologies over everybody else's biologies, and that is no longer okay, and that if they are going to engage with the right to food, they should do so in a way that's mindful of all biologies.
Thank you for your talk first. I have two curiosities about how certain attitudes we have today developed. The first one, and they may be related, and the first one is how we came to sort of think that drinking another species' milk is okay, but then not just that, we've forgotten that human milk is human food, but that there are attitudes that are pretty close to repulsion for adults anyways, not for infants, but that when we mention cheese made by like the human cheese, the different performance art things that people have done with milk, and you raise this, like people are really repelled by that idea of drinking human milk as adults, and so that's the first curiosity I have, and then the second one is also, when did we develop this idea of like adults drinking milk? As opposed to something that you stop doing, once you grow up.
Well, thank you. I'm also fascinated in this repulsion. Why is it that we're not repulsed by the milk of another species, but we're repulsed by our own milk? It's just crazy. Or why is it that we maybe love, say, the blood of another species, like we eat blood sausage, but we're totally repulsed by the idea of eating our own blood? I think there are deeply entrenched cultural views which are extremely gendered. So we know that for the longest time, female bodily fluids have been devalued. So in the Aristotelian cosmology, for example, semen was the top fluid, really the best you could do, and milk was considered like as a pale sort of disgusting female equivalent, or how do you explain our disgust for menstrual blood or vaginal secretion? Every fluid that's coded as human female has been devalued historically, so there may be something like this going on. And in terms of the historical questions of when did adults begin to drink milk, at the end of the 19th century, because so the dairy industry develops and is needed because females start working and you need a substitute for breast milk and people don't want to use wet milk food anymore. And you know, dairy farmers want to sell more milk, and so the government begins promoting milk consumption, and in this country, it was also tied to the prohibition movement. So if people can't go to the saloon and drink booze, you've got to provide a substitute, right? Because people still want to socialize. So milk drinking for adults was heavily marketed, you know, starting in the 1910s with the temperance movement and even earlier, as a substitute for alcohol. That's why milk bars were created, milkshakes were invented. And so they were, and that's also when in advertisement there were efforts to make milk drinking look more masculine and virile, and you know, like dudes go out and milkshakes. But are we? I think we're running out of time.
Yeah, we are.
Right?
Thank you so much, though.
Thank you.